In our last series of videos, we've been analyzing some data involving snowfall amounts from different years in Chicago. In this example, I want to talk about whether any of these years could represent an outlier, an extremely high or extremely low value compared to the rest of our data. And so to calculate an outlier, rather than just using our gut and saying, yeah, that looks like it's a really high or really low amount, we actually have a mathematical way to do that. And to figure out whether data represents an outlier, we're going to see if it's more than 1.5 times higher or lower than our upper or lower quartiles, our Q1s and Q3s. And so that's kind of what we're going to do in this video. Let me go back a step though real quick in case you haven't watched the previous videos. This is the set of data that we're talking about. So if you have not entered this data in your calculator yet, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and do that. Right now we've entered this into L1, or if you need help finding Q1 and Q3 and need help what we're talking about right now, go ahead and watch the previous videos and you'll see me explain how to find those values on a calculator. So pause the video now if you need to do that. Otherwise, if you are ready, let's go ahead and determine whether this sort of infamous blizzard of 1978-79, where 89.7 inches, not in a single day, but in a single season, was dumped on Chicago, and whether that really represents an outlier compared to our data. So here's how it works. Basically, there's two things you're going to want to calculate. We want to see if our data is 1.5 times the interquartile range above and below our data. What that means mathematically is we're going to take our lower quartile, our Q1 data, and we're going to subtract 1.5 times the amount of the interquartile range, the IQR value. So that's sort of our first calculation we're going to perform. Now obviously we're not going to be on the low end of this, but let's go ahead and do this part anyway. So I have some of this information I've written down up here. Again, if you need help finding this information, we've looked at how to do that in the last video. So our Q1, our first quartile, was at 29.35. Our interquartile range then, the number I calculated that we calculated in the last video, was Q3 minus Q1. That got me the 21.4. So I can do a quick calculation on this. I can see in my head though that it's going to come up negative. Since I can't have negative snowfall, I'm just going to say that bottoms out at 0. So if I had a year where I had 0 snowfall, that would definitely be an outlier. And for any of you guys out there living in Chicagoland, you know that yeah, having snowfall of 0 for a season would probably be pretty rare, pretty extreme. All right, so then really though, let's worry about the other end, the high end of the spectrum, because that's the question, whether this snowfall represents an outlier. So to find the high end, we're going to take our third quartile, our 75% mark, and I want to see if adding 1.5 times the amount of my inner quartile range brings me a value where I have an outlier. So this time Q3, let's see, that's 53.45 inches based on some statistics we've run in the last video. Plus 1.5 times the interquartile range. That's just our mathematical rule for deciding whether we have an outlier or not. Grabbing a calculator and doing that, I see that I get a value of about 89.6. And so what this tells me is that if my data is either above this value or below the 0, which obviously couldn't be, I have a true outlier. And so it looks like if that's my rule, then yes, just barely, but yes, this year would represent an outlier. This year was an extreme snowfall amount based on the data we're looking at right here, because we're above 1.5 times that interquartile range. So that's sort of, if you want to just kind of box this part off, I know it's getting messy here, if you will box this part off, that's really the two sort of formulas I guess you're using to calculate outliers, whether you're 1.5 times the interquartile range below your Q3 or above your, below your Q1 or above your Q3, you would definitely be looking at an outlier.